Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I was super blown away by all the support I got from you guys for my last video, and it really encouraged me to make another one. So I'm excited to share this video with you. Since my birthday is coming up soon, I decided that I'm gonna make a dress for it. I mean, you can't really go anywhere at the moment because, we're in lockdown, everything's closed, but I still wanted to have like a special outfit. So I saw a dress in town in a shop window and I really loved it, but I thought I could just make it myself instead of buying it. I think it was also quite expensive. And yeah, I still had this beautiful fabric in my fabric stash. This is just a small piece, but yeah, I bought it a while ago and I didn't know what project I should use it for. It was very special to me and precious, so I didn't want to use it for something that wouldn't turn out great. I think that's why I don't start a lot of projects in the first place, but I thought this dress would be perfect for it. So yeah, I had this dress from the shop window in town as inspiration and my fabric, and then I chose a pattern I already had and just altered it and sewed my dress. So yeah, enjoy the process. Alright, so I started by sketching out my ideas so I could kind of see how I wanted to look in the end, and this is the final design. And then I just kind of sketched out the pattern pieces so I knew what pieces I need. I chose to go with the cielo top by Closet Core Patterns as my base pattern to go with, but it obviously needed some changes since I wanted it to look different. So here I am just marking out all the alterations I'm gonna make. So here's the original cielo top pattern. First I joined the shoulder piece to the back piece and raised the neckline to make the shoulder part a bit wider, and I did the same on the front and also changed the neckline into a V-neck. I obviously added seam allowance to all my pieces and kind of increased the volume on the back and in front a little bit. And on the sleeve I just made it into a long sleeve, and then I added these lines. I cut them and split the sleeve apart so it's more voluminous on the bottom. I also made a front facing and some cuffs. So here I am just making the changes to the sleeve. So here are all my cutout pattern pieces that I'm gonna need. The next step is preparing your fabric. So I just put it on the floor and pinned all the pieces to it and then just cut them out. Now it's finally time to sew. So I prepared my sewing machine and started by sewing the darts on the front piece and just pressing them down. I added some fusible interfacing to one of the back shoulder pieces and cut it out. Then I pinned the outer shoulder piece with the interfacing to the back piece and sewed them together. I trimmed down the seam allowance to avoid any bulky areas. Then I went ahead and pinned the other shoulder piece to the back piece and sewed it all together. It's pretty important to press down your seams after sewing so it all lays nice and flat and it's easier to continue. If you want to sew in a label into your garment, now is a pretty good time. So I just taped my label down with this double-sided magic tape. It disappears when you wash it, and then just sewed around it. Since I don't have any additional neckline pieces, I just sandwiched the back piece in between the two shoulder pieces and pinned the pieces together and then just sewed over it. So the seam of the neckline is hidden inside. I trimmed some of the seam allowance away to avoid bulk and added some snips around the curved areas so that it can lay flat later. Then I turned the pieces around and pressed them down and stay stitched around the open shoulder areas. Alright, so I'm done with the back part and now comes the front. First I added some fusible interfacing again and then took one of the pieces and pinned it to one of my front pieces. This is the side where the buttons will be later. by the way, so this is a little bit easier to make. After sewing them together, I trimmed some of the seam allowance away, turned my pieces around and gave them a press. To ensure that my pieces will lay flat later, I added some understitching to the inside of my garment. And then again, to finish it all off, I gave it a good press. So now comes the trickier part, making the button loops. So first I sewed down this little tube and tried to pull it through with like a thread, and that didn't work. So then I tried to push through with like a little stick, and then my third attempt was pulling it through with a safety pin, which finally worked. Here I'm trying to figure out how big the button loops have to be. So this is not my final button, but it has like the same size. So I just cut out a few pieces and then marked where the seam is gonna be on the front piece and pinned all my button loops down. I secured all the button loops with a seam and then pinned the interfacing to the front piece. After sewing my pieces together, I once again went ahead and gave my pieces a press. Here I used my serger to finish off all the raw edges. To join the front and the back pieces, I pinned them together at the shoulder seam. I made the front piece a little bit bigger because I wanted some kind of ruffled effect, so I pinned it down and then took a hand sewing needle and gathered my fabric so it's all even. After sewing the pieces together, I once again trimmed away some of the seam allowance on one side and then took the seam allowance from the other side and flipped it over, pressed it down and pinned it, and then sewed over it. Now that I've pretty much finished the back part and the front part and sewed them together, I can put my top on my mannequin to see how it all looks, and I'm pretty happy with it so far. This is where the buttons are going to go later, and I obviously haven't closed the side seams yet, but I'll have to put in the sleeves first, and I'm gonna do that next. And here's the back of the top, so you can kind of see how it looks later. Alright, so now it's time to attach the sleeves. I laid out all my pieces and now I'm basically just matching up the notches and pin everything together. I'm starting by pinning the notch at the shoulder to the shoulder seam, and then I'm matching up the notches on the side, on the front and the back, as well as the side seams. And then I'm basically working my way in from the outside, and then I have to gather my fabric since the sleeve is a little bit bigger and it has to fit into the armhole. I'm doing this by hand, but you can obviously do this with a sewing machine as well. Yeah, just make sure you're using a long stitch length, like 5. After sewing my sleeves to the top, it's time to close the side seams. So I pinned it all together, and now I'm basically just gonna sew in one line along my pins. And once again, I'm giving all my seams a good press. Thanks to the help of my girlfriend and my roommate, I managed to finish these fabric covered buttons that are covered in the same fabric as my dress, and I hope they're gonna look great. So I have a little problem. So the little loops that I made for the buttons are too big, and I don't have a matching string or elastic that's like small enough because the buttons are really tiny, and so I have to go and buy some. Only problem is we're in a pretty big lockdown and no shops are open, at least no craft stores, so I'm gonna go to the drugstore because they have a pretty big like crafting area selection, so I hope I can find something there. So let's go. Alright, so I'm back and I look really tired, but also it was super cold and rainy outside, so yeah. But I just wanted to show you quickly what I bought. First of all, this is like a little kind of like a
like a fake thread. It's meant for like jewelry making, but I think it works pretty well. And I got like this like elastic band. It's like really thin, and I don't know if you can like really see. I think it's technically meant for hats, but it could work. Haven't decided which one I want to use, so I got both. And I got these two threads, because the one I'm currently using isn't really matching the color that well. But I forgot to bring my fabric to the store, so these aren't really the right color either. As you can see, this is a bit too red. This one is a bit too orange, but maybe I'll end up using them. So yeah, that's all I got. Now I can continue because I have to finish this dress today.
Okay, so since all my button loops are too big for my beautiful buttons, I have to rip all my seams open again and put my new elastic in. After opening up my seam and removing the old button loops, I laid all the buttons next to it to figure out where they're supposed to go. Then I marked everything with some chalk and then put some pins where the button's supposed to go and transferred my marks to the other side, so I know where the button loops have to go. Here I'm testing out the string and the elastic that I bought to see which one I want to use, and I think I'm gonna go with the elastic. I think it's just easier to open and close the buttons that way. Since it's really hard to pin down the elastic, I'm gonna use some magic tape again. I'm just gonna tape it down and then cut my elastic and kind of just stick it onto the tape. And to secure it even more and make sewing everything together easier, I'm gonna place another layer of tape on top of it. After placing all my button loops, I checked if it all lined up and then removed the plastic from the tape. I figured that it was easier to just kind of like understitch my pieces together since it was all like ironed and everything. So I basically just kind of pinned my fabrics together with the tape and then kind of opened it up and just stitched over it, as you can see here. Alright, so now that all my button loops are attached and finally have the right size, it's time to attach all the buttons. I'm just gonna do this by hand. It just takes some time, but it's not really, you can't really do it with the sewing machine with these types of buttons. And I got a visit from my roommate's cat as well. As you may remember, I wanted to put cuffs on my sleeve, so I just gathered the fabric to make it fit and then pinned the cuff onto the sleeve and sewed around it. To close the cuffs, I decided to just stitch over it instead of making the seam inside and invisible. I decided that I liked the look of it and it would make adding the button loops way easier. So I just pinned it together on the sides and sewed it closed. I'm almost finished with the dress, just like one little big piece is missing, and that's the skirt. So I laid the rest of my fabric on the floor and secured it with some pins, making sure that it's all like even and laid out nicely. Then I marked the line where I wanted to cut it and cut my fabric out. I originally wanted to make like a quarter circle skirt, but I didn't have enough fabric, so this is just like a simple rectangle skirt, but it works just fine. Then I gathered my skirt fabric with my sewing machine using the longest stitch length, and I made 2 rows of stitches here because I think it just gathers more evenly. After gathering my fabric, I put the top of my dress onto my mannequin and pinned the skirt around it. And originally I wanted to have the opening in the front and add buttons all the way down, but since it was like so hard to make the buttons, I decided not to do that. Instead, I closed the skirt on the side and then I matched up this seam with the side seam of the top, because then it wouldn't be so visible. And also in the future I could add a pocket into this side seam. Then I pinned the skirt to the top of the dress, making sure it's all even, and then I sewed around it. The last step in this process is hemming the skirt. So I just folded in the fabric twice and sewed over it. And that's it. I finished my dress and I'm really proud of it because I often get kind of discouraged when I'm sewing because I don't really have like a proper education on how to sew garments. Yeah, I just kind of like learned it from watching a million YouTube videos. And yeah, I just got into like sewing patterns like a year ago, and yeah. So I'm really proud that I actually did this in time. I also encourage you to just go and like start your sewing project, and like if you have like any doubts or questions, just like Google it and you'll figure it out on the way. Anyways, what I love about your dress are the sleeves. I think they're like really cool and flowy, and I love how the cuff brings it all together. I love these buttons. I'm really happy that I chose to go with fabric covered buttons. Because it just like matches really well with the fabric of the dress, even though it was like super hard to make them because they're so tiny. I really thought it would be easier, but yeah, worked out in the end. Yeah, so I hope you really liked watching the process of making a dress from scratch, and maybe it inspires you to make your own dress. Let me know in the comments. Yeah, so if you like this video and you want to see more, please subscribe, give me a like and leave a comment. And thanks for watching. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.